Environmental factors and ambulation. In my class, we spend a good bit of time talking about gait from a kinematic perspective. We look at the different phases of gait and the different periods and kind of discuss what happens in each of these portions of the gait cycle. We focus a lot on, again, weight-bearing forces, how we propel ourselves forward, and so on. We don't spend a lot of time, however, talking about how sensory input also further modifies our gait pattern. Generally, when we are walking or running, we aren't necessarily going across a stable surface, a predictable surface. We might be reacting to an opposing player, or we may be walking through the woods and having to navigate different obstacles that could come in our way. So the purpose of this presentation is to briefly talk about some of these environmental factors that can affect ambulation and gait, and specifically talk about a recently published article that I think is really unique in the way that it looked at vision and how vision is going to impact our ability to walk through a fairly complex environment. So again, when we look at walking gait, we've talked about the different phases and what happens in each part of the gait cycle, etc. And we can see in this video here of this skeleton walking a lot of what's happening. Heel strike, foot flat, and then propulsion. So we can see the different phases. And again, we've kind of studied walking gait from through a lens of walking on a flat surface, a stable surface, one that, again, doesn't really require us to change directions or change where we place our feet. Now, so it does generally, in this type of environment, we're going to see that gait follows a very specific pattern, a preferred pattern. And what's really cool about the human body is it always finds kind of the easiest ways to do things, the most efficient ways, the most energy efficient ways. It's always conserving energy. So our normal walking gait is very much structured around the body itself, the structure of the body of it itself, and how to use these different segments in the most energy efficient way. It also helps to, again, reduce environmental uncertainty and, again, make sure that we are moving through the environment in the safest way, but also the most energy efficient way. It also, finally, is aimed at getting us from point A to point B. We know where we're starting, we know where we want to end up, and our body will plan how to get there. And again, in the case of walking across a gymnasium floor without any people in the way, that's very simple. But if we want to navigate through a more challenging environment, that becomes more difficult. But generally, the body is going to try to do this in a way that is going to minimize energy costs and reduce the environmental uncertainty, and therefore keep the path that we take as safe as possible. Again, we walk on two legs. There are advantages and disadvantages to this walking pattern. By walking upright, what it does is it frees our hands to be able to manipulate objects, grab objects, help propel ourselves forward, and so on. And walking on two legs is more energy efficient than walking on four. So we have some advantages here. Another advantage by walking upright is we increase our field of vision. We've moved our eyes higher, and we therefore have a better vantage point for scouting out obstacles and planning where we're going to place our feet, again, especially when moving through a fairly complex environment. So some of the challenges, though, of walking upright is that this position is much more unstable than if we were to walk on all fours, like a horse or a dog, etc. The other challenge is that once we start to fall forward, which is what's happening in a walking gait on 2 feet, is we constantly are throwing our body weight forward, our center of mass forward, and then catching it with our other foot. Then we do the same, and then we again catch that body weight with our other foot, and so on. So we're constantly changing our full momentum, transferring our full momentum from one foot to another. And that takes quite a bit of coordination and strength. So again, there are certainly some challenges of bipedal gait, but there are advantages as well. So what is the sensory impact on gait? Well, most of our movements are certainly affected very substantially by the information we gather from our eyes, our ears, and potentially other senses, like our somatosensory sense, our sense of knowing where our body is in space without necessarily looking at that part of the body. So again, there is a fairly significant sensory impact on gait. And probably the sense that plays the biggest part is vision. We use vision very extensively to plan our movement, our path of movement, where we're going to potentially place our feet, and then adjust to changes in an environment. And again, in athletics, this is very evident. Watching a soccer game or an ice hockey match, we see that obviously the athletes are constantly changing their movement, changing directions, either dramatically or slightly, to account for changes in their environment, the position of a player, the bounce of a ball, etc. So vision plays a very big role in planning movement, including gait. It will alter things such as our movement speed. We do have a preferred walking speed, running speed, where we're most efficient, but we will change from this speed if necessary to make sure that we get to a certain point at a particular time, and so on. We also use it to plan foot placements. So if we're walking through an environment like the one below, where we see, again, slippery rocks, maybe less slippery rocks, drier places to put our feet, and so on, we will plan ahead where we're going to place our feet as we walk. When we're walking across a fairly flat, stable surface, we don't put as much emphasis into planning where we're going to place our feet. We follow kind of the most energy efficient placement pattern. So again, sensory input has a very big role on planning motions, particularly gait. So one study that I just read, and I think shows this really well and utilizes some really cool technology, is a study by Matthis et al. In Current Biology. And they wanted to look at how your body uses vision in different ways depending upon the challenge of the terrain that you may be walking across. So as you can see in the picture on the right here, they had subjects perform just a general walking task. They weren't given any other instructions except getting from point A to point B, however they chose to. And they did this on flat terrain that was a path, medium terrain that had some rocks and some bumps and so on, and then more rough terrain, which was a dry creek bed. And while doing this, they actually measured the person's footholds or foot placements. They also measured the kinematics of the body, the major joints of the body, and then they had the person wear a headset that could track where their eyes were looking at any given point in time, so they could look at where they looked and how that related to places where they placed their feet. And again, a really cool study in both the methodology and their findings. So some other details about the article. What, again, these individuals found was they measured gaze location. And as we can see in the picture on the right here, they could tell where the person was looking at any given time during this walking task. They also looked at where the people placed their feet. And again, that allowed the study to examine where did they look and how did that relate to where they placed their feet. And they also measured other kinematic features. Obviously, they had sensors on the major segments of the body, so they could draw these three-dimensional stick figures to, again, kind of illustrate walking, and also measure things such as step length, step width, and the duration of each step to see, again, did they move faster, more slowly, larger steps, smaller steps as the terrain changed. And they did this in three conditions. Again, a flat terrain condition, which was a walking path that was kind of ground, gravel, very, very flat, not really any obstacles. Medium terrain that was, again, had some rocks and some minor obstacles to get around. And then rough terrain that was a dry creek bed where people would be wanting to place their feet kind of on the larger, flatter rocks and so on. So what did they find? Well, first off, in terms of kinematic factors, how the person moved, first off, they moved slower over rougher terrain. And this makes sense, right? Because of the increased challenge, the increased of thought and attention that needs to be made to where to place the feet, we saw a slower movement pattern and slower step duration. We also saw that step length became shorter and much more variable with increases in terrain challenge. And again, shorter because they were sort of balancing from step to step. And again, more variable because they were sort of more constrained by the environment to go from one rock to another, one stable rock to another stable rock. They didn't necessarily get to choose their distance of each step. And then we also saw step duration became longer in rougher terrain, meaning they stayed on their foot a longer period of time. And again, this is probably due to some of the balance challenges. Now, the gaze factor is really neat. I find the technology to be amazing, that they could track, again, where the eye was focusing at any given time. And we see some very big differences when you read the article about where the person looked under these different conditions. On flat terrain, about 50% of the time, the individual was focused on basically a region 1 to 4 steps ahead. That means that 50% of the time they were focused beyond that, potentially looking at the environment, enjoying the scenery, looking at birds, etc. When we got to the medium and the rough terrain, we see a big change. In the medium terrain, 94% of the time they were looking somewhere within 1 to 4 steps ahead, and 96% of the time on rough terrain they were looking 1 to 4 steps ahead. So they did not let their vision or their gaze move away from that kind of immediately in front of us type of a position. Also, they, again, moved more slowly and shorter steps, more variable steps in those two terrain conditions as well. And again, because they were so much more focused on where to place their feet and so on. When they focused potentially on footholds, basically their gaze tended to look about 1.5 to 2 steps ahead. So they generally were looking not at where they're going to just put their foot right now, but where they're going to put their next foot. So because that's from what they found, that is important, because you need to not only know where you're going to place your foot next, but you need to know where you're going to go from that position so that you can plan motion. So again, people were generally looking about 1.5 steps ahead in the medium and rough terrain. So they were they've already planned where they're going to put their foot next, but then they were looking at where they're going to go after that. In the time domain, so again, if we look at not just where they're looking based upon where they're going to place their feet, but if we look at time, how much ahead in time they're looking, they tend to be focused about 1.5 seconds ahead. And this kind of goes along with some other studies where it seems that we have this window of 1.5 to 2 seconds whenever we're doing any kind of motion that we're always trying to plan. We want to know what we're doing over the next 1.5 to 2 seconds in any kind of complex movement challenge. So the conclusions from this article is that obviously sensory input was key in executing these walking motions. Much more important in the, again, medium and rough terrain, less important in the flat terrain. But again, sensory input was used in all three conditions, but again, seemed to be much more important, vision especially. Vision was much more important in these more challenging type of environments. And in general, people focus 1 to 2 steps ahead, so that they're planning on not just where to place their foot next, but what to do with their foot in that position, so they know what direction they're going to have to push to get to the step after that. This vision or gaze and foot placement concept, again, knowing this shows how the body plans for forming an efficient movement pattern and an efficient path, again, over these types of terrains. And I would say that probably we see something similar in athletes. They are going to be looking at where am I going to be putting my foot next, but also where am I going to go from there. And they're going to do this utilizing the visual information from what they can see around them, including, again, movement of the ball, the puck, other athletes, etc. So again, it gives us some idea of how vision is going to be utilized by athletes in, again, a complex movement task that we see in most sports. So this article is available full text online. The link is here on this slide. I encourage everybody to read it if you're interested in motor control and how the body utilizes vision in doing complex motor tasks. They also have videos like the one that I am showing a snippet of, and a video externally taken during the individuals going through these complex movements.